Happy Valentine's Day! I'm Laura and this is Tropetrinitytrilogy, and today for my very first bite-sized trope video, I will be discussing the top 13 tropes about falling in love. Woo! I chose these tropes in an attempt to find almost an all-encompassing list of ways to make your characters fall in love. So they aren't necessarily my favorite, they're just the most common ways, or just ways I thought were interesting enough to put on here. And also they are about how the characters fall in love, so whether or not a character is rich or a cheerleader is not relevant to this video. However, there is one type of romance that is not a trope that I would like to mention first, and that is a normal romance. The characters meet, they get to know each other, maybe they start as friends, or maybe there's an initial infatuation. But anyway, once they finally get to the point where they are interested in maybe seeing if they should date this person, one of them asks the other one out, the other person's like, yeah, I'll give you a chance, and they go on a date, they like it, they go on a second one, and they continue to go on dates until eventually, bam, they're a couple. So despite me referring to this as a normal relationship, when it comes to fiction, it is not actually that common because a steady-paced relationship isn't that dramatic, and fiction is ruled by the rule of drama. To be honest, it really isn't that much of a dramatic, nail-biting scenario that will keep your readers at the edge of their seats wondering, will they get together? However, if your individual characters are both compelling and their interactions are interesting and realistic while also being individualistic and unique and hopefully a little sweet, you could definitely get your readers rooting for them. And in fact, I have 5 reasons why you should consider writing a normal romance. One is that since it's not as popular to write a normal romance, it will actually stand out as being something more realistic. Number 2 is that it is more realistic, so people are less likely to be rolling their eyes at it. Number 3, it's more relatable due to it being more common. So again, a lot of readers will be able to find themselves within it being like, hey, I remember what it was like to go on the first date, as opposed to being like, hey, I remember when it was like when my dad threatened to decapitate my boyfriend and feed him to the Demogorgon or whatever. Number 4, a normal steady relationship is more likely to be healthy when you write it, as opposed to when you try to do something fancy with it, you're more likely to put something in that is actually not healthy. And number 5, it is a good idea to give young readers an example of what makes a healthy and normal relationship. So anyway, now that I got the normal relationship out of the way, let's get to the top 13 tropes. So this list is tentatively ordered from my least favorite to favorite, and I will be counting down from 13 to number 1. And for each of them, I will be explaining what it is, kind of the pros and cons of each of them a bit quicker than I would for a normal trope talk because it's bite-sized tropes, and I will be giving an example for each of them of it done well. Even the ones I really don't like because I am challenging myself. So for lucky number 13, we have love at first sight. This is when your characters right after they meet each other, spot each other, or at least really soon after, desperately fall in love. Now this is really unrealistic, however there is a hint of truth to that, and that is infatuation. People will see each other right away and be infatuated by someone and want to be with them. And sometimes those people actually do turn out to be a great couple and end up together. However, at the end of the day, these people who see each other right away, it is infatuation, and they aren't going to instantly be dying for each other. And unless it's maternal or paternal love, I personally do not believe in love at first sight. And if you do want to have that instant attraction, I recommend you have the relationship just be a normal relationship that goes like that. And I know that there are popular fiction that does have insta-love, like Disney Snow White, but Disney Snow White revolutionized animation, being the first full-length animated film, and proved to people that animated films was a true art form. So if your book does revolutionize fiction and art, then you can do insta-love. I obviously am not as talented as you, so you do you. However, if you do not plan on revolutionizing the art form of literature, then don't do it. However, I do think this is a great trope to deconstruct, and I think that is very interesting. Now, you could go the more Frozen route where the one person turns out to be a manipulator and evil, which does happen in real life. I recommend you foreshadow it more than Frozen. However, you can do that. However, you could also go the other way and actually have two genuinely good people who are immediately infatuated with each other, think they're in love, and then realize they're not compatible. I think that would be really interesting and nuanced, and there really doesn't need to be a bad guy in this situation. And there is only really one situation in which I can accept an insta-love romance being done genuinely. Now, this is kind of more of like my personal exception, and I don't think this is like a rule. And that is, I can accept it if we don't actually see the full romance play out and we kind of just stop really early on at the infatuation stage. And there's two ways this can be done. One would be like if your characters are instantly attracted near the beginning of the book, they get to know each other in their honeymoon phase, they're in love, and then one of them dies. And the whole book is about the other character grieving, and the point of the romance was to set up their love so you could see the character's aftermath. Now, I think there are better ways this can be done. However, I do think this is an exception because I can accept super cheesy romance if it ends tragically, like Romeo and Juliet. Except I recommend you kill them sooner because Romeo and Juliet already did it. And the other way I can accept it is if for the message or theme of your story you want to end it with your character meeting someone and being attracted to them. So it can kind of come off as a sort of love at first sight, but the ending is sort of them meeting the person, so it really is more of just like that initial attraction or spark, and it can be used as a way to show that they've healed or they've found a way to move on from their past life. And so for an example of insta-love done well, I am going with Disney's Cinderella. And so the reason why I think Cinderella was a good one is because Cinderella is not a love story. It is a story about a girl who's in an abusive family escaping it. And the prince is what happens to be her escape. It could have very easily been something like a letter to Hogwarts or some old lady adopting her. However, the reason why I think the prince was a good option, especially compared to the letter of Hogwarts, is because her situation was that she was unloved and abused. So since it was the end of the story, it was really important that where she escaped to involved her being loved by someone. Now, it didn't necessarily have to be romantic love. However, I do think by making it a romantic love that her stepsisters also wanted, it kind of showed their differences and demonstrated something about Cinderella, because the stepsisters wouldn't have wanted to be adopted by some old lady. They have their own mom. However, by having them be gold diggers who want to marry this prince, and then Cinderella's just innocently a loving person, and he comes to her and she doesn't even realize he's the prince. He's just the first person who's kind to her, which is probably not the best reason to marry someone, but I digress. It kind of demonstrates how she's more kind and her love is actually genuine, whereas they were faking it. So the whole solution of the movie is surrounded by love and genuine love versus fake love, and finally finding someone who's actually a human to love you as opposed to rodents. But I guess someone who loves rodents and sews them little clothes and protects them is a very loving person. So good for Cinderella. Okay, I'll try to be quicker for the others, so let's go to number 12. And for that one I'm combining two, and that's sex equal love and friends with benefits. So for these two tropes, they both involve two characters being physically intimate before becoming romantically involved. And they end up falling in love due to this physical intimacy, even though that wasn't their intention. Now, this trope is condemned by some people as setting readers up with the false expectation if they have a one-night stand with someone, that person's gonna fall with that for them and want to date them and stuff. And that is true. Just having a one-night stand is not going to get you a boyfriend or girlfriend. And to be honest, on a personal level, that's not the type of lifestyle I have, so I don't find it relatable, and it's something my brain doesn't really match with, so I'm kind of just like, okay, you did things. However, I will say physical intimacy does release some hormones that cause people to be at least attracted to each other in that way, which can result in the people coming back to each other to do those things, eventually resulting in them relationship growing, them getting to know each other, and falling in love. So it's not that it could never happen, but it's just not my favorite. However, if you want to write a story with tons of sexy scenes, or you're writing erotica, this might be the way to go. And it'd probably be better than having them instantly be in love. And so for my example for this, you probably know what it is. It's very well-known work of fiction. But I will give you a couple of hints for which one this is to see if you can guess it. One is it takes place in the city. 2, the protagonist works with newspapers. And number 3, there's tons of scenes of characters having sexy times. And yes, you're right, you guessed it, it is 1984 by George Orwell. What? You thought I was talking about something else? No, 1984 by George Orwell. This is my actual example though. So in 1984, it takes place in a really oppressive dystopian government. Jolie, the love interest, is a woman posing as an anti-sex activist in order to cover for the fact that she actually has tons of sex in form of rebellion. And then the protagonist, Winston, catches her eye as someone who doesn't like Big Brother, and they begin an affair. And that affair slowly turns to love, and then the rest of the book happens. But the reason why this is a good choice in romance for this book is because Winston is very indoctrinated and part of the culture he was raised in. He's angry and he resents people, specifically women, and he really hasn't received any affection from them, including his wife, which is another reason why this romance needs to be secret. However, once Winston is with her and she shows him physical affection, it's a really big deal for him, and he begins to reciprocate, and eventually it becomes emotional affection and they grow together and fall in love. Anyway, let's go to number 11, the love triangle. This is where at least one character has to choose between at least 2 potential suitors. Now, this is pretty done to death, especially in YA. However, there is a purpose to it, and that is when you have a protagonist who has 2 different ways their character arc can go. Each love interest can represent a different path, and who they choose can sort of reflect what they choose to do as an individual and in their actions for the overall story plot. And to be honest, people like romance. That's a way to have a romantic subplot that reflects the overarching plot. However, the truth is, if your protagonist is really trying to figure out who they like between 2 people and they just can't choose, they probably don't like either of them enough to be with them. And also from the suitor's point of view though, why would you want to be with someone who just considers you to be an option? Also, another problem that happens with a lot of love triangles is they tend to take over the overarching plot. So you'll have like a dystopian or a fantasy or a sci-fi. There's a love triangle and the whole dystopian sci-fi fantasy plot just sinks away. It's important to make sure that your love triangle does not take over your main plot. However, I will say that you can do a love triangle well, especially when representing changes. So a good example of a love triangle reflecting the 2 paths a protagonist must choose from is The Hunger Games, where Katniss must choose between Gale and Peeta. Peeta represents Katniss's loving side, whereas Gale represents her anger and desire for revenge against the Capitol. And the person she chooses reflects the path she chooses. And I think the book takes a very mature stance on this, which allows the love triangle to feel more natural. And that stance is that Katniss is busy first fighting in a game and surviving in it, and then leading a revolution and also surviving that violent revolution. So by having her be preoccupied and having Katniss actively be like, hey, I am busy, I'm not thinking about this, I'm trying not to die, trying not to have a breakdown, it doesn't come across as her not being able to choose between 2 guys and being like, you know, you probably don't like either of them, as opposed to her being like, I love both of you, I want you both to survive, but I don't have time to pick my boyfriend. I don't need a boyfriend right now. Anyway, let's go to the next trope, and that is number 10, will they or won't they? This is when 2 characters sort of butt heads throughout the entire story, while also having unresolved sexual tension. Throughout this story, there's this back and forth that keeps the reader wondering, will they get together, and usually rooting for them to get together. Now, in concept, I love this. However, this is number 10 for a reason, and that's because in execution, usually it feels way too drawn out, and since most of the time they do end up together, and we kind of know they're gonna end up together, the fact that it's drawn out is just like, okay, whatever, and by the time they do get together, I don't care as much as I should. I remember the TV show Bones dragged up Bones and Booth getting together for so long that by the time they did, I honestly didn't care. Now, for a good example of this one was a bit harder. However, I decided on the TV show Castle, which is another sort of murder mystery show. However, in this one, they ended up getting together sooner, and I was still invested and excited when they did get together. And also the way they got together was a lot more satisfying, with Castle kind of professing his love to Beckett and Beckett not really reciprocating right away, and then he leaves, and then she goes off doing this like crazy dangerous mission to try to avenge her mother, and she almost dies and is left dangling from a roof, and she's screaming for help, she's screaming Castle's name, and then finally someone comes to save her, and it's one of her other police officer buddies. And then that evening she comes like completely soaked from rain into Castle's doorway and is like, I love you, or something like that, and kisses him. It's like that. But anyway, yeah, I thought they were a pretty good will they or won't they, in that they got together soon enough for me to care, and there was multiple pieces that came together with one character professing his love before the girl did, and then it kind of all balancing out and being really fun and chaotic until it was like crash and kiss. Anyway, let's go to number 9, the new old flame. And that's when the characters had a relationship previous to the beginning of the story, but ended up breaking up or being separated for some reason. However, during the story, they end up reuniting and falling back in love. So honestly, I don't have a preference either way when it comes to this trope. However, I do appreciate how it's relatively unique compared to what most tropes are, because honestly most of the time we do want to see the characters when they first meet, and that is appealing, but sometimes mixing it up can be fun. And generally having characters who've already had a relationship and sort of failed at it can lead to a really interesting and fun dynamic where they do butt heads, kind of like the will they or won't they. And the good thing about this trope though is that they do have a really fun dynamic from the beginning for the readers to experience, and we still get to experience the entire relationship besides their initial meetup the second time around. A good example of this is Illuminae by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kursoff. And the reason this is such a good example is that the story is told from the point of computer documents, and the two characters are contacting each other from different spaceships. And by making them exes, they already have a really fun dynamic, and they've met and known each other in person. Whereas having two strangers meet through the documents and all that stuff wouldn't have become as dramatic with them being as desperately in love as quickly, which the story had a time limit, so we gotta get to that. And it allows them to have a really fun dynamic right from the beginning. Anyway, let's go to number 8, and that is a bit of a darker one, and that is manipulation. And this is when one character sort of manipulates or gaslights one character into a toxic or destructive relationship. This is something that should be deliberately done with the purpose of depicting an unhealthy relationship, and it shouldn't be something you do and then turn the relationship into a happy, healthy one, because that's weird and that would not happen. However, I will say a lot of fiction depicts unhealthy relationships as healthy, or just straight up depicts healthy relationships, which that's great. I love healthy relationships. However, I do think there is a value in depicting unhealthy relationships and the warning signs for them, in that by doing this, again, people will be able to identify the bad things about them, and you'll be able to contradict the other books that depict it as good. I also think this could have the benefit of depicting to young readers that there's no shame of getting out of a bad relationship, and that you don't have to get it right on the first time. Because to be honest, a lot of books, characters end up with the first person they're ever with, which, you know, that's nice, that's ideal. However, that's not necessarily the average. So again, it's fine to depict relationships that fail, and in fact it's probably good for people to see that, so they don't feel like they're doing something wrong themselves, and that they should just leave and try with something healthier. But at the end of the day, I do think there's a benefit of depicting a toxic relationship with the intention of depicting the horrors and how it's not healthy or normal, and you shouldn't feel bad about leaving it. Especially with so much fiction, depicting bad things is good. Now for my example of this, I am going with the Joker and Harley Quinn from the Batman comics. And I will say though, that this couple has so much fiction about them that some of it's good and some of it's bad. Like the live action Suicide Squad depicting the relationship is not a good example. However, if you look at some of the other fiction, like there's one iconic comic strip where Harley Quinn is talking to the Black Canary, and she admits that the Joker got her pregnant, and she was kind of afraid to tell him, but she doesn't say it exactly like that. He's manipulated her to believe the way he thinks and to be submissive to him, and Harley ended up leaving the Joker for a year because she was afraid that he wouldn't want the baby and would be mad at her. And then when she came back, he didn't even act like he knew she was gone. He probably didn't notice, and it's really sad seeing how she kind of like says, oh, it was just a joke, the way she rationalizes it to herself. And it's really depressing, but I think it's a good example of an unhealthy relationship in fiction, and a very manipulative one, because the whole thing about the Joker and Harley is how he manipulated her into loving him. And if it makes you feel better, there are comics where Harley and Poison Ivy get together and just dump the Joker and is like, you suck, I'll beat you up and all that stuff. So I like that. Anyway, let's go to number 7, and that is Unrequited Love. Going for the happy ones twice in a row. So this is when one character loves another, but that love is not reciprocated. This isn't the satisfying conclusion that your reader wants, however it is realistic, and again, I think it's beneficial to depict to readers that someone's not always gonna love you back. Just because I feel like everyone in books is so perfect and amazing, and it's kind of like, hey, you're not alone. You're not a weird loser. Everyone gets rejected except me because I'm amazing. It's also, I think, a good way to depict that if someone doesn't like you back, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with you, and that it's okay and you can move on and find someone else. And I think a great example of this is Quasimodo from the Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame. In this movie, Quasimodo falls in love with Esmeralda, and though Esmeralda does love him as a friend, she does not reciprocate romantic feelings and falls in love with a different man. And though Quasimodo is sad, he chooses to be her friend and to love her as a friend, and still works to save and protect her in the climax of the movie, and it makes Quasimodo even greater of a person. Anyway, to the next trope. This one is for a very specific situation, however I do feel that this situation would affect the circumstances in how the characters fall in love, so I think it fits these tropes. And so for number 6, that is the fake romance. So this is when, for some reason or another, the characters must pretend to be a couple, and sometimes they don't end up being a couple. However, there are other times we're being put in this situation where they're constantly close together and must act as if they care for each other, ends up making them fall in love. This trope is one of the more dramatic fiction ones that are kind of things that don't usually happen in real life. However, it is really fun, and from what I've seen, a lot of people want to read more of it. And also, I don't think it's overdone at this point. In fact, I haven't read that much of it. And personally, I would love to read a recommendation of this. However, I will say the reason this is only number 6 on my list is because I don't have one example that I'm super in love with, as opposed to some of the higher ones on the list. But anyway, example for this is a repeat example, and that is the Hunger Games, because in the first book, Katniss must pretend to be in love with Peeta in order to get sponsors from the capital to survive the games. This is a great example because it not only creates a fun, interesting situation for the two characters in which she has to be affectionate to someone where she's a very closed-off person, but it also ties into the overall plot of the dystopian and survival. But anyway, let's go to number 5, and that is Friends to Lovers. And that is when the characters are good friends either at the beginning of the story or become good friends near the beginning half of the overall story or series, but over time they end up falling in love. Or it could be done in an instant shift, however that's also known as bad writing. I have seen people say they dislike this trope because they feel it sends off the message that if you're friends with someone for long enough, they'll eventually feel romantically toward you. So if you have a crush on someone, become friends with them and eventually they'll love you. Which is not true. I do not recommend that. However, I will say personally, my brain cannot comprehend romance without friendship. So this method is a surefire way to get me on board with the romance, with the caveat that I do get to experience the friendship before the romance. If I don't get to experience the friendship and they become a romantic couple, then it has about the same effect of them just being a couple by the beginning of the story. So personally, I do like this because my brain is like, why are you dating if you're not friends? So yeah, that's just my personal thing, but I understand why people don't like this, and I do have some recommendations based on that. So one thing you should definitely not do with this trope is that the one character only realizes they like their friend once their friend gets in another relationship or shows interest in someone else, and it's out of envy or jealousy. Because that is not the right reason to like someone, and that kind of makes the romance kind of not that great. And also, do not make the romance based on physical attraction, because I've seen this and it's like, if you've known them for this long in your life, why are you attracted to them now? Now, if your characters were prepubescent friends, they went through puberty, that would make sense. However, your characters being completely stagnant and then all of a sudden physically attracted, that doesn't make sense. And my example of this is Kim Possible and Rod Stoppable, because I shipped them so much as a kid and it makes me happy. Anyway, let's go to number 4, and that is the fear of love. This is when one character, for maybe some backstory reason, or maybe that's just how they naturally are, is afraid to love. And the other person helps them open up and feel comfortable enough to they eventually fall in love with each other. Now, some people dislike things sort of like this because it feels like a sort of cure-all and like romance is the solution to everything. However, there are certain situations where this makes sense and certain situations where this makes no sense, so it kind of depends on why your character is adverse to love. You need to examine why they're afraid of love and what it would take for them to open up. Also, I will say the character should be working to grow within themselves, and their partner shouldn't just be carrying all their baggage and fixing everything. So one example which I love of this is Disney's Hercules, in which Megara had a previous love before Hercules, and she ended up selling her soul in order to save him, and then he immediately dumped her for another girl. So because of this, Megara has become very guarded and distrustful of people, specifically men. However, then she meets Hercules, who is very kind and genuine and really does want to help people. And Hercules really likes her and seems to think of her very positively, and they eventually get to know each other, and she opens up to him and realizes that he isn't bad and her expectations of everyone was wrong. And then they fall in love. Anyway, let's go to number 3, hate to love. This is when the characters first meet, they at least actively dislike each other, if not hate each other. However, over the course of the story, they get to know each other and gain a mutual respect, which eventually becomes liking each other and eventually becomes trusting and then loving. It might not be in that exact order, but it ends with love. Now, I realize that the hate to love is very close to the will they or won't they. However, my way I see them as different is that will they or won't they is a lot more sporadic, with the characters kind of being like this the whole time and then settling on love, whereas hate to love starts way down here and then shifts up here. Now, you can start with hating each other, will they or won't they, but there's always that sexual tension, whereas hate to love, I feel like, has a bit more of a gradual change with the characters developing and growing together. One thing I would like to tell you, which will help you avoid the biggest mistake in hate to love, is that the most important word in that sentence is not hate, not love, it's the two. The two, despite being the smallest word, should be the longest amount of time taken up in your story. And if you go instantly from hate to love, that will feel cheap and poorly written and not make sense. Most works of fiction, when they don't do hate to love correctly, they forget the two, so don't do that. This isn't hate love, this is hate to love. An example of this done really well is another book by Susan Collins, and that is The Underland Chronicles. And over the course of 6 books, Gregor and Luxa go from hating each other and disliking each other to slowly becoming friends and falling in love, and it's really sweet and I loved it. Anyway, let's go for the runner-up trope number 2, forbidden love. Now again, this is a bit more of a dramatic, very specific one, like the pretending to be in love. This is when two characters love each other and want to be together and can't. And you might be wondering, how is this how they fall in love? Because they already are in love, but the reason that I put this here is because the characters in this type of relationship should be constantly trying not to fall in love, and they should be constantly trying to fight against their feelings due to the imminent danger that they are facing if they act on them. And this should have a great effect on how your character's relationship develops. And though some people think this is cliche, the inherent danger and drama this causes is really fun to read. And it also allows for a lot of relationship drama without actually just making your characters not compatible. One thing I need to emphasize is, if you're writing a forbidden love, that your characters need to resist it at first, because if they're ready to die just to kiss this other person within a couple pages of your book, that is ridiculous. And I get in some books you need to speed up the timeline. However, I'd recommend keeping it as gently paced as possible. And make sure you have at least a couple of scenes of the getting to know each other before they're ready to risk their lives to be with this person. And a great example of this is the amazing movie Ever After. This is a historical fiction Cinderella retelling, and this one is a bit different than the forbidden love that most books have, in that only one character knows that it's forbidden, and that is Danielle. Danielle disguised herself as a noblewoman and went to the castle in order to free her friends who were sold into slavery by her evil stepmother. So when she ends up freeing them, the prince sees her and meets her, and they talk, and he ends up being infatuated with her. However, she has to keep it from him that she really isn't a lady as she's pretending to be, because that is illegal and she could be put to death for that. So she's constantly pretending to be someone she's not, and their love is forbidden, but he doesn't know that, and it creates a lot of tension, and it's really good, and I love that romance movie. And it builds tons of tension, and it is a forbidden love. Not necessarily the most dramatic one like 1984 or Romeo and Juliet, but it is a fun one. And finally, for my favorite romance falling in love trope, that is the slow burn romance. This is when the romance gradually develops over the course of the story. They spend time together, they get to know each other, they learn to trust each other, they become vulnerable around each other, and they contemplate their feelings for each other, and eventually they do admit their love. I just really like this type of romance because personally my brain needs time to get on board with the romance, or at least my brain used to. And I understand that sometimes a book requires a romance to be faster because of the plot. However, when this isn't necessary, I like the slow burn. And my example for this is Ismay and Gabrielle Duval from Grave Mercy by Robin Lefebvre. And this was the first book that was very heavily romance that I really got into the romance. And the thing is, I didn't realize it was a super heavy romance book until I picked it up. And then I realized it was a historical romance. I was like, wow. I assumed it was about killing people more, which there are killing people, so it's fine. But the point is, the way the characters' relationship developed slowly over the course of the novel allowed me to get into it and feel like I could keep up with it. This was the first book that was very heavily romance where I was actually really rooting for it. That's something really awesome that can never be taken away from. And I have to say, I love their romance. Anyway, I know this video was really long. I had just wanted to cover all the falling in love tropes that I could think of that kind of covered everything. So yeah, I hope this video didn't turn you off falling in love to the point that you're just like, oh, my characters are dating before the start of the book, because this is terrible. If that's the case, oh well. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'd love to hear your favorites or least favorites falling in love tropes down below. Anyway, thanks for watching, and happy Valentine's Day, and I'll see you later.